Miss Oakes, I understand that there are extenuating circumstances in your situation. However, I think you would agree that continued employment with Consolidated Oil and Gas would be uncomfortable for both you and your coworkers. With this in mind, we believe that the best course of action for all concerned would be for you to resign for personal reasons. Should you choose to do so, we would of course be happy to act as a reference and make a strong recommendation to you for your next employer. When the HR representative spoke to me, I involuntarily tensed up. I just got fired, I realized, and although I expected it, I felt my eyes begin to water. Don't cry, I commanded myself furiously. Whatever you do, don't cry. After signing the papers they gave me, I slowly made my way back to my cubicle. It didn't take me long to put away the few personal belongings I had stuffed in drawers and on shelves, and then I was already carrying my pathetic little box down the hallway. I didn't know whether to be sad or glad that none of my teammates were there to see me off. Truth be told, I was just as glad Jerry wasn't around, but I wished I could have seen Buffalo Bill at least one more time. But I knew where he was, and besides, considering what he was probably thinking of me right now, maybe it was for the best. Suddenly, a terrible thought came into my mind. What if I met Kurt Jorgensen? This horrifying thought made the tears start to flow with renewed vigor, so I bowed my head and hurried as fast as I could to get to my old Toyota to drive to my little apartment. Once there, I hurriedly started packing my things. It didn't take long. In the few months I had lived in the apartment, I probably hadn't spent more than a few weeks in it. When you work as a field auditor, you don't accumulate a lot of stuff. I bet some truck drivers spend more time at home than I do. Anyway, that was all behind me now. There was one more task left that I kept putting off. Mom, it's Annie. Mom, is it okay if I come home? And then, to my utter embarrassment and horror, I began to sob. Pulling myself together, I took the keys and the current month's rent to the property manager in the mail, and then headed to Tyler. It's only about 200 miles from Houston to Tyler, but you might as well say they're on different continents. Heading north on the I-45 freeway, I couldn't stop myself from remembering everything that had happened. I remembered sitting outside Kurt Jorgensen's office on the first day of my new job. I was both nervous and excited at the same time. I would finally meet my first boss at my first real job. Not a summer job or an internship, but a real job, and not at any company, but at Consolidated Oil and Gas, one of the largest energy companies in the world. Sure, I had excellent grades at the University of Texas at Tyler, and I did even better on the CPA exam. But I never thought I could get a job with a major corporation. I had more or less resigned myself to doing bookkeeping for my parents' rose-growing business in Tyler. Tyler is the rose capital of the world because that's where all the rose bushes grow, and my parents had been in the rose farming business all their lives. Although I doubted my prospects, when I heard Consolidated would be recruiting on campus, I jumped at the chance. Somehow they picked me to come to Houston for a second interview. When they actually offered me the position, I realized that if I didn't accept, I would regret it for the rest of my life. And so I was ready to start my new job. In fact, I had already been officially on the job for a few days, but they had been spent on the orientation program, benefits, and other induction activities. Now, however, I was ready for my immediate assignment. I had assumed I would be working somewhere in Consolidated's vast accounting department, so I was a little disappointed to learn that I was assigned to the field audit team. Accounting is dry enough as it is, but auditing is even further removed from the actual business. Essentially, it's just double-checking work that other accountants have already done. But I was in no position to argue, so I dutifully waited outside his office to meet Kurt Jorgensen, one of field auditing's principals and my new boss. When his secretary ushered me into his office, he stood up from behind his desk and motioned for me to sit in one of the chairs across from him. He was a distinguished-looking man, taller than me, probably in his mid-40s, with dark hair slicked back. While many of the directors I saw in the company wore more casual clothes, he was dressed in a suit, white shirt, and tie. His clothes and mannerisms gave him a commanding, even commanding look. "Miss Oakes," he began as I sat down, The commodities we extract, refine, and distribute are vital to the economies of many countries around the world. A shortage of oil or gas can cripple national economies and topple heads of state. Our financial results are eagerly awaited on major stock exchanges, not only because of their immediate impact, but also because they are seen as harbingers of the economic future. Therefore, our corporation is under intense scrutiny and regulation, and our financial results are carefully analyzed. For these reasons, it is critical that every transaction of the company be accurately recorded and consistently reported. Moreover, all transactions must strictly comply with generally accepted accounting principles and consolidated oil and gas standards. It is the job of the Corporate Audit Department to ensure that these standards and procedures are consistently and uniformly applied throughout the corporation. You are now part of the team charged with this critical mission. Are you ready to take on this responsibility? I gulped. Oh, yes, sir, I told him. Very ready. Very well, he said. I shall expect nothing less than excellence from you. With those words, he summoned his secretary and asked her to take me to meet the rest of his audit team. Following her, I tried to gather my thoughts. What an impressive man, I reflected. He talks about our work as the most important role in the company. And then I was still trying to make sense of my interview with Mr. Jorgensen when the secretary led me into a moderately sized room divided into 3 cubicles, with a conference table and chairs in the center. She led me over to one of them and introduced me to Jerry Higgins. Jerry is our accounting systems specialist, she told me. Jerry seemed very familiar, not because I had met him before, but because he looked like many of the math and accounting students I had met at UT Tyler. He was of average height, but the buttons on his shirt were straining to hold up his stomach. He needed a haircut. Another math nerd, I thought to myself. Then I smiled inwardly. Just like me. I introduced myself to him and asked about his role on the team. Those were the last words I spoke for the next half hour, as Jerry launched into a lengthy technical description of Consolidated's corporate accounting software. As he spoke, I couldn't help but think of students like him that I had met in college, especially Tom. I dated Tom for half a semester during my junior year. After Tom, I hardly ever went on dates. So, what do you think? Pretty amazing, huh? Asked Jerry. I snapped back to the present and, nodding, tried to look enthusiastic. I had no idea what he was talking about. Well, I guess I should introduce you to Buffalo Bill, Jerry continued. Buffalo Bill? Asked I. Who's that? Oh, this is Bill Hitchcock, another member of our crew. Everyone calls him Buffalo Bill, he explained. Oh, brother, I thought to myself. What have I gotten myself into? As we approached another booth, Bill must have heard our arrival because he stood up and immediately extended his hand. Hi, I'm Bill Hitchcock, but everyone calls me Buffalo Bill. What's your name? Hi, I'm Ann Oakes, I told him. Where are you from, Ann? He asked, and when I told him I was from Tyler, Texas, a smirk appeared on his face. He said. Ann Oakes from Texas doesn't fit at all. I'll call you Annie Oakley. I looked at him carefully to see if he was laughing at me, but his smile was so open and his laughter so infectious that I couldn't help but smile back. Truth be told, I was secretly pleased. Growing up, the other kids always called me Orphan Annie, so the new nickname Bill suggested suited me just fine. Okay, I'll be Annie Oakley if you tell me why you're called Buffalo Bill, I replied with a smile. Sure, he replied, and I recognized that this was his usual way of agreeing with people. Actually, Bill said, there's not much of a story behind my name. I went to the University of Colorado, and I was hired as one of the trainers of the school mascot, Ralphie the Buffalo. We took him around the stadium during all the soccer games. One day, Ralphie got excited and took off. All the other trainers fell and lost their grip on their lassos. I was the only one who managed to stay on him, and I've been called Buffalo Bill ever since. I couldn't help but smirk as I pictured Bill being dragged across the soccer field by a real buffalo. But I felt anxious about my new job, so I asked him to tell me about his work as an auditor at Consolidated. As Bill began to narrate, I listened intently, but also tried to understand him. If Jerry was the typical nerd, Bill, I assumed, must have been the class president at his college. He was tall, even taller than me, and good-looking, with a mop of blonde hair and blue eyes. I bet he's broken quite a few hearts, I thought snidely. But I couldn't help but feel disappointed when I lowered my gaze and noticed the wedding ring on his left hand. Stop it, I said to myself sternly. He wouldn't be interested in you anyway. When he finished describing his duties, Bill asked me about myself. There's not really much to tell, I replied. I was born in Tyler, lost my parents, and lived in an orphanage for a while. My foster parents took me in when I was 13 and raised me. They wanted me to be around when I went to college, so I enrolled at UT Tyler. At first I majored in math, but my dad convinced me there weren't many job opportunities there, so I switched to accounting. 4 years later, I had my degree in CPA, and I ended up here. You got your degree and passed the CPA exam in 4 years? Asked Bill. You must be very smart. It usually takes at least 4.5 years. Well, since I lived at home, it was easy for me to take summer sessions and finish early, I explained. Well, we're lucky you did that, Bill said. The audit department usually recruits a whole new team at the same time. 6 months ago, our original team included another woman named Betty Murphy, but she quit after a few months. So we were short-staffed before you came along. Why did she leave? I asked curiously. I don't really know, Bill said. One day she was here and the next day she was gone. I guess she just wasn't happy here. And what's it like working at Consolidated? I asked him. His eyes sparkled. Well, the first thing you have to learn is that only the executives call the company Consolidated. Everyone else just calls it COG. I guess that makes us just another little cog in the big COG, he said, grinning crookedly at his own joke. I rolled my eyes. Okay, what's Mr. Jorgensen like? He's very demanding, something of a perfectionist, Bill replied. But if your work is done right and turned in on time, you won't have any problems with him. Kind of like my dad, I thought to myself, or Professor Hunter at UT Tyler. The last thought made me blush slightly. I had a crush on Professor Hunter. It was nothing like that, but apparently I was attracted to strong, strong-willed men. So what do you think of Houston? Asked Bill, bringing me out of my reverie. It's so big, I replied. It's kind of overwhelming. Bill looked at me perplexed. Is this your first time here? Now I was really blushing. Yeah, I've never been anywhere but Tyler. My folks always wanted me to stay close to home. Bill's face reflected surprise for a moment, but he quickly hid it with his infectious smile. Once you get used to it, I think you'll like it. It took Denise a while, but she's coming around now. Denise? I asked. Denise is my wife, Bill told me. He turned in his chair and picked up a photograph from the table. The picture he held out to me showed a beautiful young woman at a party. I bet she was the head cheerleader, I thought to myself. To Bill, I said, She's beautiful. Thank you, he said. I think so. So, let me show you your stall, Bill continued. Hey, Jerry, how about helping Annie Oakley get used to the company intranet? Such was my introduction to the audit team. The first few days I was a little cautious about talking to Buffalo Bill, because I never feel comfortable around popular guys. But he seemed very open and sincere, and he had a great sense of humor. Jerry was still a nerd, but once you got to know him better, he seemed like a pretty nice guy. Only Mr. Jorgensen remained distant and unapproachable. In addition to working in close quarters, Buffalo Bill, Jerry, and I had regular lunches together. We were one of a dozen audit teams, and the firm encouraged each group to spend as much work time together as possible to foster close working relationships. At the same time, we were discouraged from getting too close to other company employees who were not on the field audit team, since we would likely have to audit their work sooner or later. A few days later, Bill was away on business during lunch, and Jerry and I were eating together at the conference table when he asked me, So, do you have a date for the company picnic? What company picnic? I asked in surprise. I don't know anything about it. Well, it's being held next weekend, Jerry told me. It's a big event. The big shots of the company will be attending, and we all have to go. The company is renting a big amusement park for the day. It's a lot of fun. He looked at me slyly. So you're going with your boyfriend? I blushed. I don't have a boyfriend, I told him. Good, he said triumphantly. Then why don't you come with me? Alarm bells rang in my head. I was definitely in trouble. Jerry, I don't think that would be a good idea. Jerry's face darkened. Of course I realize, he said grudgingly. I'm not good enough for a hot girl. Not good enough? A hot girl? What is he talking about? In confusion, I asked myself. But I needed to say something, so I muttered, No, it's not that at all. It's just that I'm not dating right now, and besides, it might interfere with our working relationship. Luckily, at that moment, Buffalo Bill returned and joined us. Although Jerry was clearly still unhappy, to my relief there was no more talk of a picnic or a date. After lunch, I returned to my table, but kept thinking about the awkward situation with Jerry. Truth be told, I hadn't had much practice in dealing with guy advances, and I really didn't know how to handle them. I had definitely messed up. And why had he even asked me out in the first place? If there was one thing I wasn't, it was a hot girl. I finally decided that Jerry probably didn't go out much either, so he might find any woman, even me, attractive. I glanced over at Buffalo Bill's booth and saw a picture of his wife. Now that was a hottie. When the weekend came and the company was going on a picnic, I was seriously contemplating whether or not to go. I don't navigate social situations very well, and besides my teammates, I didn't know anyone, so I wouldn't have anyone to talk to. Nevertheless, I didn't want to make the mistake of not showing up to an important company event, so I reluctantly decided to go. I double-checked everything with Mr. Jorgensen's secretary, and she assured me that the dress code for the occasion was the most casual. So I put on an old pair of jeans that hid my nondescript legs well and a big white Houston Astros t-shirt. I hoped I could blend in. When I pulled up to the amusement park in my old Toyota, the picnic had already started. The invitation said free tickets to all the rides and plenty of beer and barbecue, and a large crowd had already gathered in the park. I figured beer would be the main attraction on such a hot day. After I presented my company badge, the girl at the entrance asked me to fill out a name tag. Hi, my name is Ann Ux, the sign read, and I obediently pinned it to my shirt. No sooner had I entered the gate than I was jumped on by one of the HR executives who had attracted me to Kyoji. Good thing he was wearing a name tag, or I wouldn't have remembered his name. Apparently, he couldn't remember my name either, because he kept looking at my name tag. Hello, Miss Oakes, he said, mispronouncing my name. A lot of people do that. Hello, sir, I replied, and it's pronounced ox like trees. That's right, he said. So how do you like working at Consolidated, Miss Ox? I decided to ignore the mispronunciation, and he continued chatting with me about the company. Aside from his questions, which seemed pretty pointless to me, I also found the conversation awkward because I was a few inches taller than him, and he had to look at me all the time. This wasn't really unusual for me. I started growing up early, and by the time I was a sophomore in high school, I was only a few inches short of 6 feet tall. This made me not only the tallest girl in my class, but taller than most of the boys. Not surprisingly, I didn't have much of a social life. What boy would want to date a girl who towers over him? So I was used to boys looking up when talking to me. Luckily, I noticed Mr. Jorgensen strolling nearby and used him as an excuse to interrupt my conversation. Oh, there's my boss, I said, and started waving. Mr. Jorgensen, I called out. Hello, this is Ann Oakes. As I approached him, I realized that he was accompanied by a rather formally dressed woman who appeared to be several years older than Mr. Jorgensen. As I approached him, he said, Hello, Miss Ox. I'm glad you could make it today. I want you to meet my wife, Edith. Turning to the woman, he said, Edith, I'd like you to meet Ann Oakes, the newest member of my audit team. Mrs. Jorgensen froze for a moment, slowly looking me over from head to toe. I felt almost like a specimen under a magnifying glass. It must be my height, I thought. Then I heard her mutter, About what I expected. After a moment, she raised her eyes to me and asked, "Where are you from, Miss Oakes?" "I'm from Tyler, Texas, ma'am." "Tyler? Well," she said, "no doubt you're glad to get away from this dusty little town." Before I could think of what to say, she turned to her husband. "Come on, Kurt. I want to be sure to talk to your vice president before he opens too many cans of Lone Star. Have a good day, Miss Oakes." As she started to leave, Mr. Jorgensen smiled slightly at me and said, "Have a good time." Then he turned and followed Mrs. Jorgensen down the cobblestone path. Standing still, I asked myself, what's this all about? It seemed impolite to me to disparage someone's hometown, but perhaps people in Houston express themselves differently. And what did she mean by saying I was about what she expected? Had I offended her in some way? While I was pondering what had just happened, I was almost knocked off my feet by the swift figure of Jerry Higgins. As I stumbled, he grabbed me and jerked me to my feet. I could smell the beer in his breath. "Hey, Annie," he said a little too loudly. "I was hoping to find you. Look, let me show you around this place. There are lots of great rides here, and look at the arcade. Oh, and we should also buy you a beer." Before I could catch my breath and start protesting, he was already dragging me down the path toward the beer tent. Luckily, when I looked that way, I saw Bill Hitchcock walking in our direction with 2 cans of beer in his hands. "Buffalo Bill," I shouted almost desperately. "Over here!" "Jerry, Annie Oakley," he echoed. "Hi, I was hoping to see you guys." Walking over to us, Jerry sullenly let go of my hand. "Look, you two go ahead. I'm going to grab another beer." With those words, he walked away, looking at me over his shoulder. "What's this all about?" Bill asked me. Then, seeing the look on my face, he asked worriedly, "Are you okay?" "Right now I think so," I replied, but I was a little out of control for a moment. At Bill's request, I told him about the conversation with Jerry at lunch, as well as today's meeting. "I don't want to offend Jerry, but I don't know how to handle him," I admitted. Bill looked at me with his little smirk. "I wouldn't worry too much if I were you, Annie Oakley. Jerry's a nice guy, but he doesn't know how to approach the opposite sex. And when you add a little beer to the mix, his lack of social manners shows through. But don't worry, he'll show up on Monday hungover and apologizing, so you'll see." I hesitated, but Bill took my hand and led me in another direction. "Come on," he said. "I want you to meet Denise." As we walked down the path, he apparently realized that I was still nervous about meeting Jerry. "Come on," he said. "Don't worry about it. Besides, I bet you get hit on by guys all the time." "What?" "No," said I in surprise. "Why would guys hit on me?" He looked at me with a strange expression, but before he could say anything, he noticed his wife. "There she is," he said. I looked where he was pointing and saw a woman who looked like the picture on Buffalo Bill's desk. She was wearing designer blue jeans that tightened her legs like a second skin and a white sleeveless blouse that fit her well. Her hair was gathered into a ponytail, which she passed through the opening of her baseball cap. Completing the look were large aviator sunglasses. Her outfit reminded me of a movie star trying to remain incognito. I could never look like that. I'm all elbows and knees. As we got closer, I saw that she was engrossed in conversation with a familiar figure. "Isn't that Mr. Jorgensen?" I asked. Bill shook his head with a sarcastic expression. "That's Denise, right? She's always trying to help me advance my career. She's very ambitious." As we approached, Mr. Jorgensen must have seen us, because he stepped away from Denise and turned to leave. "Excuse me," he said, "but I have to catch up with Edith." With those words, he withdrew. "What's all this about?" asked Bill to Denise. "Never hurts to have a word with the boss," she replied simply. Then, before Bill could answer, she turned to me and looked me over from head to toe, just like Edith Jorgensen. "So, who's your friend?" she asked. "This is Ann Oakes," Bill said. "She's the new member of our team I told you about." "Oh, yes," said Denise. "Now I remember." She took off her sunglasses and looked at me again. "Your tank top would look a lot better on you if it wasn't covered in barbecue sauce." I looked down and gasped in horror. My t-shirt had several large red stains on it where Jerry's hands had grabbed me. As I unsuccessfully wiped the stains with a tissue, Denise turned to leave. I need to meet a friend, Bill. I'll catch up with you at the beer tent. Then she looked back at me and said unceremoniously, Nice to meet you, Miss Ox, and then walked away. Bill was chagrined. I'm sorry, he said. I don't know what got into Denise. She's not usually like this. Then he looked at my face and saw that tears were streaming down my cheeks. Don't cry, he said awkwardly. Let me help you with your blouse. Ned, he grabbed the napkin he was holding and started to blot my shirt, but then came to his senses and handed the napkin to me. I wiped my blouse ineptly, but then gave up. Instead, I turned around and headed back toward the exit. Don't go, Annie, Bill said helplessly. It's okay, I said, snorting. I need to get home and take the thing to the wash before it gets permanently soiled. Anyway, I think I've had enough fun at the picnic for one day. With those words, I staggered toward the exit, slumping my shoulders to hide the stains on my tank top, not to mention the tears in my eyes. What a terrible day. I thought with annoyance as I started the car. My Astros jersey must be ruined. Everyone I've met has been rude, weird, or obnoxious, and I don't know what I've done wrong. Not for the first time, I wondered if I had made a mistake in taking the job. The Monday after the picnic, Buffalo Bill asked me to go to lunch with him. After we ordered, it was clear why. He wanted to apologize again for what had happened at the picnic. I told him I'd forgotten about it, but it soon became clear to me that he wanted to talk about his marriage. I think Denise might have been rude because she's having a hard time. At first, she didn't want to leave Dallas, and now she's having a hard time accepting that I travel so much for work. We talked about it before I got the job, and I warned her that in this job, I would have to be gone a lot, he explained. But at the time, she was thrilled that I was working for a large corporation and making a bigger salary than what I could find elsewhere. I guess she didn't think much about compromise back then. He paused to take a big bite out of his sandwich. But now she's lonely and unhappy that I'm away so often. It's a little stressful at times, and I think that's why she was so rude to you at the picnic, he said. I'm sorry, Bill, I sympathized. I understand how hard this has been for both of you. If we can get through the next couple years, he said, I can save up enough money to do what I really want to do. Open my own accounting firm in Boulder. I've never been to Colorado, I told him. But then I've never been anywhere outside of Texas. What's it like? Bill looked at me with a detached look. It's beautiful there, he said in an almost reverent tone. It's in the foothills of the Rocky Mountains, where the mountains meet the prairie. There are all kinds of outdoor activities there, and although the town isn't that big, the university attracts a lot of attractions. I'd love to move there someday. That sounds wonderful, I told him sincerely. How does Denise feel about it? His face lost a little of its enthusiasm. She likes the big city better, he admitted. But if I could get her to try it, I think she'd fall in love too. Then he seemed to come out of his reverie and looked at me again. I didn't mean to go out of my way, but I wanted to apologize for her and tell her she's not usually like this. I brushed him off, but Buffalo Bill being so candid made me feel a little better about my horrible weekend. I felt like he was becoming a friend, and I really needed that. What they don't tell you about auditing in school is how lonely the job can be, at least for a field auditor. For the next 2 months, I probably spent at least 4 days out of every week away from home. Because of this, it was very difficult to make friends or put down roots. If we were on the road all week, we were allowed to come home on the weekends, but that only gave us time to get through the mail, pay bills, and do laundry. I had to throw out probably half a fridge of groceries before I realized that it was better to buy very little and eat mostly at home. You also have to stay away from people at the facility because you have to check on their work. We were usually assigned a separate room to work in, and we only met the locals in formal sessions. As a result, they usually treated us with suspicion and even hostility. All in all, it was a rather lonely existence, and I was not surprised that the turnover rate was so high, even though we were paid well. The only salvation was my teammates. Buffalo Bill was a pleasure to be around, and we became buddies. He could always cheer me up with a joke or a funny look on my face when work got too hard. But I also found that I could open up to him about my life and my feelings, and he would patiently listen to me and cheer me up. If it wasn't for him, I probably would have run home to Tyler. Even Jerry turned out okay. Monday after the picnic, he was very apologetic about his behavior, even though I told him I had already forgotten what happened. I think he was still interested in me, because every now and then I caught his intense stares. But I just ignored it, and nothing else happened. It also turned out that he was very knowledgeable about COG's automated accounting system. When there was a problem with the system, he seemed to know almost instinctively where to look. It only took a few situations like this for Bill and I to be very happy to have Jerry as part of our team. Only Mr. Jorgensen remained. He was still a mystery to us. His responsibilities as senior director included interacting with the local management. He met with them to discuss our scope of work, communicated with them when problems or questions arose, and communicated the final results when the audit was completed. His management style struck me as odd and detached. After the first meeting with local management, he would gather us together and give us our assignments and any special requests or concerns. After that, we hardly saw him during the day. But several times during each audit assignment, he called one of us into his room in the evening to analyze our work. Sometimes he used these meetings to tell us about special situations we might have encountered in the unit we were auditing. Other times he reviewed our work, pointing out deficiencies. It felt like we were taking a college course taught by a particularly demanding professor. Buffalo Bill, Jerry and I often talked about him, trying to understand him. Although we saw him so infrequently, he always seemed to know what we were doing. He never praised us for doing a good job. He just expected us to live up to his high standards. The truth is, although he rarely raised his voice, he intimidated us. We respected him, but we also feared him. The first time he called me to his room for one of his afternoon reviews, I was terrified. When I knocked on the door at the appointed time, he told me to come in. I walked over to the couch he was sitting on and stood in front of him, waiting while he reviewed whatever was written down in the notebook that was on the coffee table. After a few long minutes as I stood there, trying not to shake in my boots, he looked up at me expressionlessly. "The quality of your work is acceptable, Miss Oakes. Your work rate is a little slower, but I attribute that to the fact that you have recently started work. However, I expect improvement over time. Your interaction with the local accounting team has been positive, and you are looking good. That will be all for today, Miss Oakes. I will contact you for the next review session in a few days." With those words, he went back to his laptop, and I realized I was fired. As I walked down the hallway, I felt encouraged. I was expecting to be told off, but instead my work pleased him. And then another thought hit me. He even complimented me on my looks. As I walked past the mirror in the lobby, I noticed that my face was glowing. Of course, that didn't stop him from reprimanding me the next time for not adhering very strictly to COG's graphic standards in my last presentation. After that session, I went back to my room, snapping at his criticism but determined to earn his approval. I desperately wanted to prove that I could meet his standards. I was interested in watching the other two students' reactions to Mr. Jorgensen. Jerry hated him because he was frankly afraid of our boss. Jerry may have had a grasp of our systems, but Mr. Jorgensen would catch him in error time and time again because the system couldn't account for the exceptions we invariably encountered. When this happened, Mr. Jorgensen would blame Jerry for the shortcomings of the system, and Jerry resented it bitterly. He believed it was not his fault and lived in fear the next time it happened. Buffalo Bill treated the whole thing like some kind of game. He kept score for each of us and gave mock prizes for the least number of blunders during the audit assignment. I think Mr. Jorgensen must have been aware of Bill's attitude, but Bill was never cocky and frankly made very few mistakes, so there was little Mr. Jorgensen could do. I also think Bill's sense of humor and his refusal to get into Mr. Jorgensen's routine helped keep us all grounded. Even Jerry couldn't get angry when Buffalo Bill started imitating Mr. Jorgensen by saluting Hitler and strutting around in goose step. But that all changed on our trip to West Virginia. Charleston was COG's shale oil headquarters, and although the office wasn't very large, shale oil production had skyrocketed. Consequently, HQ wanted to keep a close eye on operations. I had never been to West Virginia before, but of course I had never been outside of Texas either. Since West Virginia is in the mountains, I assumed it would be cool, but Buffalo Bill had warned me that summers there could be hot and humid. So I checked the weather forecast, left my usual pantsuits at home, and brought along some summer dresses. They were lightweight, yet long enough to hide my legs. I really appreciated Bill's warning because it was 93 degrees that day when we arrived at Yeager Airport. Mr. Jorgensen had arrived the day before, and when we got to the COG office, he called us in to hand out assignments. Up to this point, I had worked exclusively with accounts payable and receivable, so I was shocked when he assigned me the asset valuation job. He must have noticed the indecision on my face because he singled me out. Miss Oakes, it's time to take you out of your comfort zone. You can't expect to do nothing but accounts payable and receivable all the time. You have to be prepared. Didn't you learn asset valuation standards during your induction? Is that going to be a problem? Yes, sir. I mean, no, sir, I stammered. I mean, yes, sir. I have familiarized myself with asset valuation, and no, sir, it won't be a problem. Very well, he said stiffly. Plan to bring your results to me tomorrow evening for review. With those words, he moved on to assignments for Jerry and Buffalo Bill. Then he let us go. As we were driving back to the hotel, Buffalo Bill turned to me. I don't know why Jorgensen is picking on you, he said. I don't remember him changing assignments like that before. Maybe he didn't like the way I handled the last assignment, I replied pessimistically. No, that can't be, Bill said. I checked your work and it was perfect. You checked my work? I asked in surprise. Of course I did, Annie Oakley. I was just looking out for you, he said with a wink. Then his voice became more serious. Just follow the procedures carefully and double-check your work. You'll be fine. I nodded. I was determined to earn Mr. Jorgensen's respect, no matter what he pulled. As for Buffalo Bill checking my work, I couldn't decide whether to be angry at his peeping or appreciate his concern. By the end of the next day, I decided that my concerns were unfounded. Everything seemed to be in order, and I had no trouble memorizing the rental property appraisal procedure from our briefing. So I felt quite confident when I knocked on Mr. Jorgensen's door in the evening after dinner. He didn't say anything when I entered. Instead, he kept looking at whatever was on his laptop screen. Finally, he looked up and stared at me like I was a bug under a microscope. Miss Oakes, are you completely incompetent? I jerked back as if he'd punched me in the face. He didn't pause. Your work on the shale lease valuation was completely wrong. You failed to comply with our corporate accounting standard, and your work for that day was a waste of my time. What do you have to say for yourself? I began to find it hard to breathe. This can't be happening, I thought. Sir, there must be some mistake. I'm sure I did the calculations correctly, I sighed, grasping at straws. Is that so? He said wryly. Well, see for yourself. With those words, he held out his laptop to me, and I saw that it had COG's online accounting standards open. There, clear as day, were the procedures for estimating the value of oil and gas leases, and they were vastly different from the way I did it. At that moment, all the old fears and insecurities I had so diligently suppressed over the years came flooding back. How could I have been so stupid? How could I have let Mr. Jorgensen down? I felt my throat constrict and tears flowed down my cheeks. I couldn't do anything but stare dazedly at the floor, unable to comprehend what had happened. You do realize that I am obligated to report your deficiencies in your evaluation, he said coldly. It will certainly affect your rating and your future with the company. Oh no, I thought. I'm going to get fired. How will I explain to my parents that I'm not good enough, that I failed? Isn't there anything I can do, Mr. Jorgensen? I pleaded. I can recalculate the values. It will be right by morning. That will hardly be enough, he said coldly. Even if you correct your mistakes, I'll need some reason to be sure you won't be so careless in the future. You'll have to take some sort of punishment to demonstrate your commitment. I'll do anything, Mr. Jorgensen, I wheezed. Please give me another chance. I'll show you I'm worth it. He looked me over from head to toe. He set the laptop aside and turned to me. Very well, Miss Oakes. If you are willing to accept your punishment, perhaps I can overlook your misbehavior. He beckoned me to him. What is he saying? I asked myself. What does he mean? He wanted us to get on with it. And yes, we did. Okay, Miss Oakes, you can go. I'll expect corrected asset valuations in the morning. Somehow I managed, stumbling, back to my room. As soon as the door closed and locked, I threw off my clothes as quickly as possible and climbed into the shower, desperately trying to wash away all traces of what had just happened. As the water poured over me, I tried to comprehend what had happened. He used his position and power to force you to do this, screamed a voice in my head. It's your own fault for being so careless and doing so poorly, another voice replied. You got what you deserved. I scrubbed my head under the shower, trying to banish the thoughts, but it didn't help. Finally, I turned off the water. I still didn't understand why I had let Mr. Jorgensen treat me like this. The fact that I didn't fight back only added to my shame. Finally, in desperation, I carefully sat down in front of my laptop, opened up online standards, and began to redo the report I had messed up so badly. Immersing myself in numbers and formulas was the only way I could take my mind off my worries. I don't know what I looked like the next morning, but when Buffalo Bill saw me, he had a concerned expression on his face. Are you all right, Annie? He asked anxiously. I'm fine, I lied. It's just that I had trouble sleeping last night. Bill brushed it off, but I noticed that he continued to look at me throughout the morning. When Mr. Jorgensen walked into the room, I thought I was going to pass out, but he didn't even look at me or mention anything that had happened the night before. By the time he was done, I had recovered a little. But as he left, he looked at me and said, Miss Oakes, I'll see you in my room after dinner. I must have gone pale, because Bill looked at me again with a concerned expression on his face. But before he could say anything, Jerry began to tease me. Annie Oakley's in trouble, he said. I went limp in my chair, and Bill turned angrily to Jerry. Shut up, Jerry. You don't know anything about this. Jerry sullenly went back to his computer, and Bill walked over to me. Are you sick, Annie Oakley? You're as pale as a ghost. No, I'm fine, I replied desperately, trying to find an explanation. It's just, I think I might be getting my period. Bill blushed with embarrassment. Oh, I'm sorry, Annie. I didn't mean to pry, It's okay, Bill. I just need to go to the ladies' room, I said, and hurried out of the room. Once I got to the restroom, I splashed some cold water on my face, and that seemed to help a little. Somehow I managed to get through the rest of the morning, and at lunch, I only picked at my food. Later, the boys invited me to have dinner at a restaurant they found in Huntington, but I declined, saying I was going to order room service. But I didn't. There was no way I was going to eat, knowing that I would soon have to go back to Mr. Jorgensen's room. Somehow, I managed to pull myself together by the time I had to go. I made sure to put on the only pantsuit I had brought with me, hoping that it could protect me from whatever he was up to. I then headed down the hallway toward his room, feeling like a death row prisoner walking the last mile. When I entered Mr. Jorgensen's room, he was sitting on the couch, holding a computer in his lap. I went over the asset data you corrected last night. I'm satisfied that everything looks in order and done to COG standards. A wave of relief came over me. Perhaps it wasn't that bad. His next words dashed my hopes. Nevertheless, yesterday's mistake was very serious, and it must not happen again. It is my duty to see to it that you do not forget it. Come here, Miss Oakes. And we were at it again. As I stumbled my way to his bathroom, I looked at myself in the mirror. This must be what a whore looks like, I thought bitterly. When I washed up and came back in, he had already zipped up his pants and was working on his computer again. Good night, Miss Oakes, was all he said, and I realized that I had been let go. Somehow I managed to get back to my room. I had never felt so low in my life. Part of me wanted to go to my parents and forget about everything, but the thought of having to tell them what had happened terrified me. They had warned me, and I had ignored them. If I went home, I would not only have to feel their disappointment in me, but I would have to admit that they were right. Eventually, I burst into tears and fell asleep. When the bell rang, I somehow managed to get out of bed and make myself look decent. The only thing that kept me moving was the realization that we had to catch our next flight in the afternoon. I certainly didn't want to stay in Charleston. Mr. Jorgensen would usually summarize the audit we were finishing and give us instructions for the next assignment. The thought of having to face him made me panic, but as the morning wore on, he didn't show up. Instead, Bill received a phone call, and after hanging up, he informed us that Mr. Jorgensen had returned to Houston early. Even more unusual, Bill informed us that Mr. Jorgensen would not be accompanying us on our next audit assignment. The three of us were to fly to Oklahoma City and do a quick audit of the COG office there. "Why the hell are we even going back to OKE City?" grumbled Jerry. "I mean, we weren't there that long ago." "I have no idea," replied Bill, "but that's what the boss said, so that's why we're heading there." The fact was that Bill and Jerry had already been to our Oklahoma office once this year. What's more, COG's operations there were small, and the last audit had found no discrepancies. Neither of us could understand why another visit was necessary, but I was so relieved that I wouldn't have to meet with Mr. Jorgensen that I didn't care. During the long flight that afternoon, I sat next to Buffalo Bill, and he kept watching me with the corner of his eye. Several times I almost snapped and told him what had happened, but I was so ashamed and embarrassed that I couldn't bring myself to do it, even though it was killing me to keep my secret. Besides, I thought, he had Dennis to think about. The last thing he needed was for me to dump my problems on him. I felt terribly alone. We arrived in Okie City late in the afternoon. Jerry and I checked into a hotel, and Bill, as our acting supervisor, went to the COG office to meet with the local comptroller. Over dinner that night, he told us about the first session. "These guys think we're crazy," he told us bluntly. "The controller told me that nothing had changed in the last few months and that it was a waste of his and our time. Honestly, the more I learn about this situation, the more I think he's right." We continued to talk about it for the rest of dinner. It was too late to do anything about it that night, but we agreed that Bill would contact Jorgensen the next morning to update him on the situation and see if there were any problems we didn't know about. When we arrived at the COG office that morning, Bill picked up the phone and tried to reach Mr. Jorgensen. After hanging up, he turned to us in frustration. "His secretary told me he's taking the day off," he said. "What are we supposed to do now?" Jerry and I were equally perplexed by the situation. The only thing we could think of was to go to the site and continue the audit, following our standard protocols. But that plan didn't work either when later that morning the accounting system at the facility suddenly failed. There was nothing left for us to do but sit and wait for information services to figure out what had happened and get the system back up and running. After waiting for an hour, we finally got an update. The motherboard in the server that housed the accounting system had failed. We were told it would take 2 days to get a replacement board delivered and restart the system. "That's it," Buffalo Bill said. "Let's go to the airport and see if we can catch a flight home. If they still want us to do that stupid audit, we can come back on Monday." We got to the airport just in time to catch a direct Southwest flight to Houston. As a result, we landed early in the morning. Jerry immediately rushed to get the car and head home, but no sooner had I left than Bill grabbed my arm. "Listen, I need to talk to you." I tried to refuse, but Bill insisted, and I just didn't have the strength to resist. Bill found an unused landing gate and directed me to it. "Okay, Annie, what's going on?" he demanded. "You've been looking like warmed over death for the last 2 days. What's wrong?" "Nothing," I told him. "Nothing." He took both my hands and looked me straight in the eyes. "I think I know you well enough by now to know that something bad has happened to you. I'm your friend, Annie Oakley. Please let me help you." I stared at him for a second, And then all my resolve crumbled and I started sobbing. He put his arms around me to comfort me and held me until I regained my composure. Then he took me at arm's length again and said, "What's the matter? You can tell me." And I told. Once I started, I couldn't stop. As I spouted the story, the look on Bill's face changed from disbelief to shock to anger. "That son of a bitch!" he shrieked when I finished my sordid tale. "He used you!" "No," I screamed. "I mean, my body didn't mind." "It doesn't matter," he said angrily. "He used his power to intimidate you and make you do something you didn't want to do." "But it was my fault, Bill. If I hadn't screwed up the valuation of the assets, none of this would have happened," I told him. "First of all, even if you were wrong, it's not a big deal. We've all made mistakes at one time or another. Besides, you fixed them overnight, didn't you?" he insisted. "Yes, but he was the only one who noticed my mistake. I let him down, I let the team down. I screwed up and I deserve to be punished." "That's crazy," Bill snapped back. "At worst, you might have deserved a reprimand, but not this." Then his eyes narrowed. "You didn't molest him, did you? You didn't say or do anything to indicate that you were interested in him, did you?" "Of course not," said I indignantly. For a few minutes we sat in silence, but then a new thought struck me, and the tears began to flow again. Buffalo Bill had been so sweet, trying to cheer me up, but now I wished I had never told him about it. He was the only person whose opinion mattered to me, and now he knew how stupid I was. Worse, he knew I was a slut. Why had I told him? Why couldn't I keep my shame to myself? Suddenly, I couldn't stand being around Bill, knowing what he thought of me. I jumped to my feet and rushed down the terminal. Bill was caught off guard, and that gave me enough of a head start to get away before he could catch me. I didn't seem to have lost my cross-country ability. Now I knew what I had to do. I called Mr. Jorgensen's office and, when his secretary answered, asked for directions to his home. "I have some very important papers he's expecting today," I told her, and she gave me his home address without hesitation. As I drove, I went over in my head what I was going to do. My idea was simple. I was going to confront him face to face and demand that I be transferred to another audit team. It wasn't a good plan. I had no idea what I would do if he refused, but it was the only way I could regain some control over my life. And, the little voice in my head whispered, it's the only way you can hide from all the people who know what kind of girl you really are. When I pulled up to his house, I was so scared I was shaking, but I forced myself to get out of the car, walk up on the porch, and ring the doorbell. I waited, but no one came to the door. I was overcome with relief. He must not be home. But I sternly told myself I had to make sure, and walked around the side of the house. Sure enough, I heard sounds coming from inside the wall that girdled the backyard. There was a wicket in the fence, and I walked over and opened it to peek inside, but immediately recoiled in embarrassment. Oh my gosh. The sounds I heard belonged to a couple making love in a lounge chair by the pool 10 feet from the gate. I immediately recognized Mr. Jorgensen's dark hair and threw my head back to avoid being seen. No wonder he didn't hear the doorbell ring, I thought. The two of them were making so much noise that an army could have come in, and they wouldn't have noticed a thing. Then the picture I had taken flashed through my mind, and I froze. The woman was not Mrs. Jorgensen, of that I was sure, because she was too young. But she seemed familiar to me. I walked back to the gate and looked inside again. The couple had switched places, and now the woman was riding him like a galloping bronco, grunting and cursing. There could be no doubt. It was Denise, Buffalo Bill's wife. I stood in a daze as I heard a car stop on the turnpike in front of the house. I hurried back into the house, hoping to make it to the car and get away before someone caught me trespassing. To my horror, I saw Bill himself get out of the car and head in my direction. Indecision paralyzed me, and that gave Bill time to walk over and grab me. "Jorgensen's secretary told me you were headed this way," he said. "You haven't done anything stupid, have you?" "Come on, Bill, we've got to get out of here," I said, tugging on his arm and trying to get him to get back in the car. But he wouldn't leave. "What's going on?" he demanded. What have you done? Nah. Suddenly, there was a shriek from the other side of the fence, and Bill popped his head up. It was Denise, he shouted. He ran over to the wicket behind which I was playing Peeping Tom and yanked it open, but stopped in amazement at the sight before him. Her wife and the boss. With a growl, Bill burst through the gate and lunged for the chair. From the force of Bill's jerk, Denise was thrown backwards and fell into the pool with a scream. That's my wife, you bastard! Bill roared and punched Jorgensen. Bill turned to Denise, who had climbed out of the pool. What the hell do you think you're doing? He yelled. To my amazement, Denise's response was calm and measured. I'm sorry you found out this way, Bill, but it doesn't change anything. I'm leaving you for Kurt. He and I are going to get married as soon as his divorce and mine are finalized. Bill gasped, as if he'd been punched in the stomach with a fist. You're leaving me for Kurt Jorgensen? He asked dully. Yes, Bill. I'm leaving you for Kurt, she said, as if she were talking to a child. He loves me, and I've grown to love him. Besides, he has more ambition than you, and he'll be able to provide for me much better than you can. Really? Asked Bill loudly. If he loves you so much, why did he entertain Annie Ox earlier in the week? Oh, I squealed as if I'd been pricked. How could he say that? Annie, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean it to sound that way. Bill tried to apologize. He turned to comfort me, but Denise did it first. You bitch! She shouted, looming over me with claws extended. Stay away from Kurt. He's mine! Bill quickly grabbed her before she could reach me, and I stood there in shock. Then my gaze was caught by movement in the house, and Kurt came out of there in a bathrobe followed by the Houston Police Department. I want him arrested for trespassing and assault, he shouted, pointing at Bill. 2 police officers quickly headed toward Bill to take him into custody. After the police officers talked to everyone, they let me go, but took Bill away in handcuffs. Denise and Mr. Jorgensen came to the door to watch me leave. I thought I saw him laughing as I pulled out of his driveway. That night I was in a daze. My brain was so overloaded that it could no longer do anything but the most mundane tasks. Eventually, I collapsed into bed and fell asleep like a murdered man. The next morning, I suppose the same autonomic system allowed me to get dressed and drive to the office. Bill wasn't there, but Jerry was, and he turned to me with a grin when he saw me. Gee, if it isn't Miss Goody Two-Shoes. So I wasn't good enough to date you, but you didn't mind having fun with Kurt Jorgensen. I shuddered. If Jerry knew what had happened, the whole company had to know about it. Sure enough, 15 minutes later, I got a call from Human Resources asking me to come to them immediately. I was sure I knew what that meant, and I turned out to be right. I drove down the highway home to Tyler that day, unemployed, ashamed, and humiliated. The only thing I was missing was a scarlet letter A that I could wear on my blouse to show my parents. Next part. I was so grateful when my foster parents took me in all those years ago. I was 13 years old and had been living in an orphanage since I was 6. My father ran away when I was very young. I only have faint memories of him. When my mother died in a car accident, she had no other living relatives. The authorities tried to find my father, but they never did, and I had no choice but to give him to an orphanage. I had just about given up hope of finding a family to live with when the Psyches came along. They had fostered several children over the years and agreed to take me in when they heard my story. I don't know if I loved them the way you love your real parents, but they were kind to me and did their best to raise me right. What they lacked in closeness and affection, they more than made up for with their care and concern. If they were strict and demanding, I knew it was out of concern for my safety and development. If you've ever lived in an orphanage, you know that feeling secure is worth a lot, and I was always grateful for everything they did for me. So you can imagine how painful it was for me to admit to them what had happened. I felt I had to be honest, so I confessed everything. My big mistake, my failure to stand up to Mr. Jorgensen, my being fired from Consolidated. When I was done, my parents had nothing to say, but I realized how disappointed they were in me. Making matters worse was the fact that they were against me leaving for Houston in the first place. My father wanted me to stay and do bookkeeping on their rose farm, but I was raring to go to the big city and the big corporation. Now I was forced to admit that they were right all along. So I went back to work at the nursery. The first thing you should know about a commercial rose nursery is that it is pretty much the same as any other kind of farming. You are at the mercy of weather, insects, disease, changes in supply and demand, and all the other factors that make farming so difficult. You might think that bookkeeping on a rose farm would be easy, but you'd be wrong. Mom and Dad grew roses in half a dozen different categories, and there could be as many as 50 different varieties in each category. That's a lot of SKUs. In addition, their nursery sold not only to garden stores and mass merchandisers, but also directly to gardeners. Keeping track of orders ranging in size from one plant to thousands for a large retailer can be quite challenging. So over the next few months, I immersed myself in the intricacies of the rose growing business. It didn't take me long to figure out how I could automate the bookkeeping, and I was glad I could help them do it. But I also soon saw that the business was not very profitable. Interest on crop loans was cutting into profits, and bad weather or falling prices almost certainly meant losses for the season. It was clear to me that Mom and Dad would have to work for a long time before they could even think about retirement. In the back of my mind, I thought that if I achieved great success at Consolidated, I could help them a little financially. But of course, that dream died along with many others. Farm work kept me busy. If it wasn't terribly exciting, it at least helped take my mind off of what happened at Consolidated. But there were times, especially in the evening, when I couldn't help but replay in my head everything that had happened. I remembered how excited I was when I started my new job. For one thing, it was the first time I was truly on my own. Even college didn't give me that kind of freedom since I lived at home all but one semester. Also, I had to admit that I was proud of myself for getting such a coveted job at a large corporation like COG. But pride precedes a fall, and my pride took a big hit when I failed my rent estimate. As punishment, my boss, Kurt Jorgensen, bullied me, and what he did stirred up all those bad memories of my days in the orphanage, and I was powerless to resist. The whole episode was so painful and humiliating that even now when I remember it, tears come to my eyes. And when I finally tried to tell Mr. Jorgensen what had happened, there was that terrible confrontation at his house. No wonder I was fired the next day. I had been foolish to go there, and foolish to make the mistake that got me in trouble in the first place. In fact, the more I thought about it, the more convinced I became that I had been a fool to think I could go off on my own into a world that didn't really want me. At least in Tyler, I was safe in a small but familiar world. This is the best place for me, I decided, even though I was sad to cast my dreams aside. But apparently, the big world decided it was too soon for it to use me for its entertainment. It was late evening that fall, and I was going over our receipts when there was a knock on my small office door. No sooner had I looked up than there came a voice I had never hoped to hear before. "You're a hard man to find, Annie Oakley." Oh my gosh. I threw my head up, and my eyes confirmed what my ears had already told me. There stood Buffalo Bill with a wide grin on his face. I jumped to my feet, ran up to him, and put my arm around his shoulders. "Buffalo Bill, what are you doing here?" asked I in rapturous amazement. "Looking for you," he replied with a laugh. And that proved to be no easy task. The only phone number and email address I had belonged to Siaji, so they didn't help. Then I remembered that you live in Tyler and that your parents have a rose farm. But I was stumped when I learned that there was no rose grower in Tyler with the last name Oaks. But I remembered that you told me you were a foster child, and I figured you must have a different name than your parents. So I came here. I think I've been to every rose nursery in town trying to track you down. At that moment, my dad walked in to see what had caused the commotion. "Dad," I said excitedly, "this is Bill Hitchcock, one of the men I worked with at Consolidated." "Nice to meet you, Mr. Sykes," Bill said, extending his hand. My father frowned and rested his hands at his sides. "It's not you." "No, no, Dad. It's not him. Bill was my best friend in Houston. He was trying to help me, I quickly interjected. Okay, Dad said, extending his hand to shake Bill's hand. Sorry to be rude, but Houston was a bad place for our Annie, and we don't take kindly to many people from there. Then he turned to leave. Now I'll let you two catch up with each other. But don't be long. Annie has to finish this batch of bills. I will, Dad, I promised. Then I turned to Bill again and led him into the small reception area outside my little office. When we were seated, I continued our conversation. Tell me what's going on with you, Buffalo Bill, I asked. The last time I saw you, you were being hauled off to jail. A sarcastic expression appeared on his face. I spent that night in a cell, but they let me out the next day. I was told that Jorgensen had dropped the charges against me. I'm sorry I wasn't there, Bill, I told him. They called me in the next morning and fired me. After that, all I could think about was getting out of Houston and back home. Bill's face darkened. It's all right, Annie. Besides, as soon as I got to the office, I got fired too. So you're talking to an unemployed accountant who's rapidly squandering his savings. I didn't even think about that. Geez, Bill, what are you going to do? I asked him. In the long run, I'm going to do what I've always wanted to do. Move back to Boulder and start my own accounting firm, Bill answered without hesitation. But first, I need to take care of some unfinished business in Houston. I thought I knew what he was talking about. Sure, Denise. What's going on with her? Bill rolled his eyes. Annie Oakley. It's just a fairy tale. I went to see a lawyer about the divorce the day after I got out of jail. Denise was fine with the divorce. She was anxious to be free of me so she could marry Kurt Jorgensen. She signed the papers as soon as they were served, the decree was entered, and now we're in a 60-day waiting period. I reached out to squeeze his hand. I'm sorry, Bill. Despite the way things happened, I know it still had to hurt. Thanks, Annie, he said, looking into my eyes. I'm almost over it, but it did hurt. I really thought Denise was the one. I guess it just goes to show that sometimes you don't know someone as well as you thought you did. Then he straightened up. But that's not the end of the story. It turns out that Kurt has been lying to Denise all along. He never had any intention of divorcing his wife and dating Denise. Bill smiled thinly. And that's not all. It turns out Jorgensen has had similar antics in the past. Remember I told you about Betty Murphy, the woman who was a member of our team before you joined us? I found out that Jorgensen pulled the same stunt on her that he did on you. That's why she quit so suddenly. Then it's not just me, I thought, and for some reason I thought that was a comfort to me, though I felt sorry for Betty. What about Mr. Jorgensen's wife? I asked. I don't understand why she puts up with his behavior. She had to know about it, didn't she? That's where it gets interesting, Annie Oakley. Edith Jorgensen obviously loves the fellow and is willing to overlook his little flings. Not only that, she even seems to be cleaning up after him. When Betty left, I think it was because Kurt's wife overbought her. I know for a fact that Mrs. Jorgensen paid Denise to stop making a fuss. One day, Denise threatened to sue Jorgensen, and the next day she left town without saying a word. That's so weird, I told him. I just can't understand why Mrs. Jorgensen would want to hang on to him after all that. For that matter, if he's so eager to find other women, why doesn't he just leave his wife? Bill shook his head. Why she puts up with that bastard, I have no idea. But I'm pretty sure I know why he won't leave her. Turns out she's the daughter of the former COG president. Not only does she have all the family money, but she also has a lot of influence in the company through her father. She's not just gravy for Kurt. She's the reason the company didn't fire him. What a fool Denise was to think he would ever leave her. I shook my head in surprise. I knew I'd never understand people and the reasons why they acted the way they did. I'd better stick to roses. They're much more predictable. But then I remembered what Bill had said a minute ago. Well, if you're settled with Denise and no longer working at COG, why are you still in Houston? This time, there was an unpleasant note in his smile. That's my unfinished business, Annie Oakley. I'm suing Jorgensen for breaking up my marriage, and I'm suing COG for helping him do it. Don't you see that on many occasions when we were away doing our background checks? When he wasn't attacking women like you and Betty, Jorgensen flew home to meet with Denise. Xiaoji was aware of his behavior and looked the other way. In my opinion, they were just as guilty as he was. But I thought it was over between you and Denise, I said, surprised. I thought you were happy to be rid of her. I am, he said with conviction. But that doesn't mean I'm going to let Kurt Jorgensen ruin my life and get away with it. And I certainly won't let Consolidated Oil protect him and let him go unpunished. I shook my head. I understand why you feel that way, Buffalo Bill, but how can you hope to stand up to a corporation that big and win? I know you're right, Annie. The chances are slim. But I just can't stand by and let it all happen to me and do nothing about it. Anyway, I found a cool lawyer in Houston who has made a career out of being a thorn in the side of the COG. She's beaten them before and has agreed to take my case on a contingent basis, so I think I have a fighting chance. He paused and looked at me. And here's another thing, Annie. I may have a secret weapon. What are you talking about? He looked at me impatiently. It's you, Annie. If you go back to Houston and testify about what Jorgensen did to you, we can prove that he's a predator, that he's done this kind of thing more than once, and that the COG covered up his actions to protect him. I couldn't suppress a shudder at the thought of having to face Mr. Jorgensen again. Oh, Bill, please don't ask me to do that. I want to help, but I don't think I can face that man again. I've spent the last few months trying to forget about all of this. To make me remember it all again is asking too much. I could see that he was disappointed, but I also noticed the worry on his face. He leaned over and took both of my hands. It's okay, Annie Oakley, I understand. I remember how traumatized you were when all this happened. I guess I was just hoping that time and distance would help you heal. The last thing I wanted to do was make you suffer even more. What about Betty Murphy? I asked. Won't she help prove your point? Bill sighed. She won't testify either. She feels the same way about Jorgensen as you do. I tracked her down and she told me she's been going to counseling since she left COG. She just can't stand dealing with all of this again. He looked at me carefully and then seemed to make a decision. Forget about testifying, Annie. I should have realized it wasn't fair to ask you to go through with it. He took my chin and lifted my face so that I was looking at him. But no matter what, I really don't want you to hide from life here on your ancestral farm. You have so much, but you don't realize it. You're a smart, talented, beautiful woman, but you don't see it because you had such a rough start in life. It doesn't have to be this way, trust me. He let go of my chin and dropped his hands to his sides. Now he looked awkward, uncomfortable even. Before I go, I'd like to tell you one more thing, Annie. He paused, as if gathering his wits. I didn't come here just to ask you to testify. I also wanted to tell you that I miss you and really want to see you again. He blushed, lowered his eyes, and headed for the door. There he stopped and turned around. If you change your mind, call me, or if you just want to talk, or maybe come visit, or... He paused uncertainly, then suddenly turned back to me, and before I realized what he was doing, he leaned in and gave me a quick kiss. Then he turned around and headed for the exit. He stopped and turned around again, but this time he had his usual wide grin on his face. I hope to see you soon, Annie Oakley. With those words, he walked away. I finished the bills in a daze. Buffalo Bill likes me, thought I in surprise. He says I'm pretty. I'd always thought Bill was handsome, but he'd been married when I was in Houston, so he'd become my good friend, and that's all I was to him. But now, I took the day's account report to my father. He took them and looked at me. Is that boy gone? He asked. I nodded. Good, he said. It's best to put all this nonsense behind us. I think I'll take a walk, Dad, I told him. I walked out the door and headed toward the fields. The light was starting to fade, but I could still see well. I loved walking through the pink fields when I wanted to think. Maybe Dad's right, I thought to myself. The thought of going back to Houston was frightening. I felt so uncomfortable there, so out of place. The prospect of running into Mr. Jorgensen again was almost unbearable. Truth be told, I always felt out of place, never comfortable wherever I went. Moving from my mother's house to the orphanage and to the Rose Farm had taken its toll on me, and I certainly never felt comfortable with myself. Growing up without my parents was hard. Being tall with long, skinny legs and arms made me the object of constant jokes from the other kids. Even discovering I had a talent for math made me feel different. By the time the Psyches became my foster parents, I had already learned to be as inconspicuous as possible. Not drawing attention to myself was the best way I knew to survive in this world. But as I remembered, Bill didn't think I was all that clumsy and awkward. He called me beautiful. Was that really true? Had I changed over the years and just not noticed it? Or was he just trying to be nice to a poor country girl, especially since he wanted me to do something for him? How could there be any way to find out? As I walked by, I noticed a bunch of old rose bushes cast aside. They were returns, roses that the customers didn't like for one reason or another. We couldn't do anything with them after they were returned, so they were tossed aside. Later, they would be burned. I looked at the unwanted bushes lying on the ground with bare canes sticking out at various angles and thought to myself, the unwanted roses were back here. No one wanted them, and they had nowhere to go. Just like me, I thought. Tears came to my eyes, and I wiped them away furiously. Then something caught my eye, a bit of color among the brown and green of the dying plants. I walked closer, and to my amazement, I saw a yellow rose. Even though it was unwanted, discarded, and left to die, one of the discarded roses had somehow managed to bloom. I stood there for a long time looking at it and thinking. Finally, I straightened up and walked back into the house. Mom was in the kitchen cooking. "Mom," I said, "I'm going back to Houston." I thought she would be shocked, but she just looked at me, tilted her head slightly to one side, and said quietly, "Are you sure, dear?" "Yes, Mother. I must try again. Can you explain to Daddy?" She nodded, and I grabbed her and hugged her. "Thank you, Mom. Thanks for everything." I then went to my room and started packing. Buffalo Bill had left me his cell phone number, and I called him the next morning as I drove south on the highway. He was surprised when I told him I was coming, but I got the impression it was a pleasant surprise. "What made you change your mind?" he asked. "It's a long story," I told him, "but let's just say I'm not going to be discarded without a fight." We met in the parking lot at the Hart's Chicken, and I surprised him by greeting him with a firm kiss. He didn't say anything when we went inside, but he had a goofy grin on his face, so I guess he didn't mind. Over a plate of Texas wings, he brought me up to speed on the lawsuit. "The hearing is in the next couple days, so we don't have a lot of time," he told me. "I've set up an appointment for you to meet with my attorney, Randy Rubenstein, this afternoon. She has a peculiar personality, but she's the best, believe me." As we entered Miss Rubenstein's office, she seemed as curious about me as I was about her. She was petite and round, probably no more than 5 feet tall, and wore a suit jacket over a flowy skirt that reached to the floor. She had salt and peach hair, which she wore parted down the middle, and looked to be in her mid-50s. When she spoke, there was a Middle European accent in her voice, but it was impossible to understand what she wanted to say. "I want you to tell me everything about what happened on the audit trip when you were attacked," she said. "Don't leave anything out." I liked her cavalier tone, and I boldly proceeded to tell her what had happened. But when I got to the story of what had happened in his room, all my emotions came over me, and I burst into tears so hard I couldn't go on. "It's okay, honey," she said soothingly, holding out a box of tissues to me and waiting for me to come to my senses. "There's a trick to getting through this. You need to stop thinking about yourself. Instead, imagine you're watching a drama on TV. Tell me what the actors are doing on the screen." Oddly enough, it helped. When I stopped saying I and me and started saying she and he, it made the story less personal, and I was able to manage describing what happened. When I was done, she had me go through it again, but this time she had me retell the last events of the trip first and move backwards. By the time I was done, the experience no longer seemed as overwhelming as it had in the beginning. Miss Rubenstein made a few notes in her notebook and then turned to Bill. Bill, would you mind leaving us alone for a few minutes? I'd like to speak to Miss Oakes alone. I was taken aback and Buffalo Bill looked puzzled, but he got up and walked out, closing the door behind him. I wondered what I should expect. Why do we need to talk without Bill, Miss Rubenstein? I asked timidly. Before I get to that, I want you to call me Randy and I'll call you Annie, she said. We're on the same side, and I want you to feel at ease with me and be able to say whatever you want. As to why I asked Bill to leave, I did it because I want to tell you some things that you may not be very pleased to hear. I want you to feel free to say, "Go to hell, Randy," if you want. I laughed, but she didn't, and I wondered if she meant it. Annie, when we get to the courtroom, the consolidated attorney is not going to be nice to you. He'll try to argue that this whole thing is your fault. He'll try to make it look like you're a slutty girl who wanted to sleep with her boss to get ahead in the company. As she spoke, I could feel myself turning pale. No, I protested. That's not true. You know it, and I know it, but our job is to convince the judge, she replied evenly. Right now, I think our chances are less than 50-50. My heart dropped. She tilted her head and looked at me appraisingly. Bill has told me a little about you, and I've had the opportunity to observe you. Would you like to know what I learned and why I made the observation I just shared with you? I guess so, I answered hesitantly. Annie, I know a little about your past and some of the difficulties you have faced. Under the circumstances, I am surprised that you are doing so well. However, the truth is that you are not a very confident woman. You don't like to be the center of attention. Even now, as we talk, I can see you twisting and turning, trying to hide in that chair. I blushed, realizing how I'd shrunk in the chair. I believe your account of what happened in Kurt Jorgensen's room was true and accurate, she continued. Your account was clear, but you presented it in a hesitant and unconvincing manner. If you do so in court, your behavior will disprove what you said, and perhaps the judge will have doubts about your credibility. My heart dropped again. I knew she was right. We were doomed. If she noticed my desperation, Randy didn't show it in any way. Instead, she changed her tone slightly. But I also know something else about you that you may not have thought about, she continued. I looked up curiously. For example, I know that despite all the obstacles you faced, you managed to get first place in your accounting class. I started to protest, but she waved me off. I know that you managed to get a highly coveted job at Consolidated in the face of considerable competition, not only from other UT Tyler graduates, but also from more prominent universities, she continued. Most importantly, she said, I know you turned Bill down when he approached you for help at Tyler, but you somehow found the strength to accept the challenge. I'd like to know where you found that strength, Annie. I found it in a yellow rose, I replied quietly. A look of bewilderment flashed across her face, but she continued. Wherever you found it, you showed me that you have the resources you need to face the challenges before you. You can handle this one too, if you remember everything you've accomplished so far and believe in yourself. I hoped she was right. I wanted to believe, but it was so hard. Randy wasn't done with me yet. Now I have homework for you for today and tomorrow. In a folder on my desk are copies of all the documents, files, and affidavits we have been able to gather on this case. I want you to go through them tonight to refresh your memory of all the details. I want you to be as knowledgeable and up-to-date as if this had just happened yesterday. I don't want any surprises when we enter the courtroom. And if you see anything that jogs your memory, or any new information or insight that we can use, I want you to let me know right away. I nodded, took the package from her, and got up to leave. Wait, she commanded. There's something else in there. I hurriedly sat down. I noticed something else about you, Randy said. You use your clothes to hide from people. You try to be inconspicuous even though you are an attractive young woman. Your appearance suggests that you are not confident, and I want it to express your confidence. I want you to look different, to make you feel different on the witness stand. But all my clothes look about the same as this one, I protested. She reached over to her desk, pulled out a business card, scribbled words on it, and handed it to me. My daughter works as a personal shopper at Nordstrom's at the Galleria. Take this to her tomorrow morning and tell her I want you to look confident and attractive. She'll know what to do. When I went out to the waiting room, Bill was waiting impatiently. As we were pulling away, he asked what Randy had said, and I told him because I wanted to know his reaction. He tried to be diplomatic, but I could tell he agreed with Randy's assessment of me. Truth be told, I thought so too. I just didn't realize it was so obvious to everyone else. But I was a little surprised by Randy's instruction to buy new clothes. I've never heard of anything like that, Bill, have you? He admitted that he'd never heard of it either. But I think you should trust her, Annie Oakley. She's been crossing swords with major corporations her whole career, and her track record is amazing. I think she knows what she's doing. I only shook my head in surprise. It had all happened too fast. Buffalo Bill offered to take me out to dinner. Someplace better than the Hart's Chicken, he promised, but I declined. Randy gave me a bunch of homework for today. I'll just go back to my motel room and get on it. If I get hungry, I'll order a pizza, I told him. He nodded, but I could see he was disappointed. When I opened the folder in my room, its contents immediately flooded me with a flood of memories. There was a plethora of material, from corporate brochures to accounting manuals, from emails to policy updates. And it all looked and felt like COG, a place I'd be happy to never think of again in my life. Still, if there's one thing I'm good at, it's learning, so I immersed myself in the material without hesitation. It was almost 10 o'clock when something caught my attention. I checked it once more and then picked up the calendar to double-check the date. When I realized where this was going, I couldn't help myself. "That son of a bitch!" I screamed. I hastily pulled out the contact information Randy had put in the packet. I didn't feel like calling her house at this hour, but I was angry enough to decide to do it. "Randy," I said when she finally picked up the phone, "I think I found something important." As I explained what I'd seen and its significance, I could almost hear her smirking into the tube. "Just don't talk about it, Annie," she admonished me. "We'll just hide it in the quiver and pull it out when the time is right." I promised, and disconnecting from the phone, began to get ready for bed. I did the first half of the assignment okay, but I wasn't so sure about the second half. The next morning at 10 o'clock, I drove to Galleria and walked into Nordstrom's store. At the customer service counter, I showed the card Randy had given me, and very soon an energetic woman approached me. I had no doubt that this was Randy's daughter. She looked just like her mother must have 25 years ago. "Hi," she said to me cheerfully. "You must be Annie Oakes, and I'm Mindy Cohen. My mom told me to expect you today." As she led me away, I asked, "So you're the Wizard of Oz to give me courage?" She laughed merrily. "No, but I'm here to make you look great, which is almost as good." I noticed we were passing the women's clothing departments. "Where are we going?" I asked Mindy in confusion. "Aren't we supposed to buy me clothes so I can wear them tomorrow?" "We will, but we need to do a little prep work first," she said with a laugh, pointing me toward the beauty parlor. "You're not going to cut my hair?" I asked in alarm. Mindy only smiled and held out the card Randy had given me. On the back were 2 words underlined with the stroke of a pen. "Works." She ignored my protests and reluctantly led me into the parlor. 2 hours later, I hardly recognized the woman staring back at me from the mirror. Not only was my hair styled and brought up to date, the talented young woman was patiently teaching me how to apply makeup, which I had never done before. I was in mild shock. Next, Mindy took me to the clothing departments. In the past, shopping had always been easy for me. I would walk into Walmart, find what I needed, buy it in a large size, and leave. With Mindy, shopping became an entire ordeal. I tried on endless outfits, tried on different sizes, and did alterations. By the time we were done, I was exhausted. Finally, late that night, Mindy put me in the car to drive me back to the motel. "Don't let anyone see you before the hearing," she reminded me. "You're going to knock their socks off, and you want it to be a surprise." Back in the room, I couldn't resist trying on my new clothes again. I couldn't believe it. The woman looking back at me from the mirror on the wall looked like she had just stepped out of a modeling agency. The clothes clung to my body and showed curves I didn't realize I had. My legs and arms no longer looked skinny and awkward. Instead, the stranger I saw looked confident. Damn it, I thought. Maybe I can do this after all. The next morning, I had to take a cab to the courtroom because I was still putting on my makeup. It took me longer to put all that stuff on than I was used to. Everyone else was already seated waiting for the judge. I took a deep breath and walked into the hall. Randy was the first to spot me, and when she saw me, she smiled broadly and gave me a thumbs up. Then Buffalo Bill turned around. At first, he only gave me a brief glance, but suddenly his head jerked back and he stared at me in amazement. I saw his eyes widen, and then he muttered, "Annie, is that you?" I just smiled and carefully walked in my new 4-inch stilettos to the row where the witnesses were seated. Once I reached my seat, I sat down and pulled my pencil skirt up so that it was just above my knees, then carefully smoothed out the short jacket that hugged my curves. Remembering Mindy's instructions, I sat down, pulling my shoulders back and straightening my spine. I may be scared to death on the inside, I thought, but I won't show it on the outside. Out of the corner of my eye, I glanced at the defendant's desk. There he stood, my nemesis, Kurt Jorgensen. He looked at me uncertainly, as if he didn't recognize me. Good, I thought. Let him worry about me for a change. The morning began with Bill's testimony, and after Randy finished with him, there was a lot of cross-examination, often hostile. I was getting more and more nervous. After a lunch break, I was finally called to the stand. "You can do it, Annie," I kept telling myself. "You're no longer the same girl who ran away from CLG so many months ago." Randy quickly recounted to me the details of that horrible week that had started in Charleston and ended in Houston. I kept reminding myself to sit up straight and describe what had happened as if I were watching it on TV. Finally, it was time for cross-examination. The COG attorney was dressed in a Western-style suit and cowboy boots that clacked menacingly on the marble floor as he approached the witness stand. He stared at his notes for a moment, then suddenly asked, "That evening in question, Miss Oakes, is it true that Mr. Jorgensen found a serious error in the work you finished that day?" "I did not make a mistake," I replied calmly. "But the process I used was not in accordance with Consolidated's current procedure for accounting for oil leases." "As I said," he continued, "the work was not done correctly." I said nothing. "And Mr. Jorgensen reprimanded you for the error, didn't he, Miss Oakes?" "Yes, sir." "How did you feel at that, Miss Oakes?" I was shocked. I couldn't understand how I could have made such a mistake, I admitted. "Could something like that have negatively affected your performance evaluation?" "Yes, sir," I admitted. "And didn't you suggest trying to find a way to make up for your mistake?" "Well, yes, but—" He interrupted me. "And didn't you offer to take it up with Mr. Jorgensen if he would overlook your mistake?" "No, that's not true," I exclaimed, but he interrupted me before I could finish. "So everything that happened between you was on your own initiative and entirely voluntary on your part, wasn't it, Miss Oakes?" "No," I cried out again. "He made me—" With a wave of his hand, the lawyer turned to the bench. "That will be all, Your Honor. We have no further questions at this time." Randy stood up quickly. "Your Honor, I'd like to ask my client a few more questions on cross-examination." The judge invited her forward. "Keep your courage, Annie. You can do this," Randy whispered as she approached her. Then, already in a normal voice, she said, "It appears that the cause of this incident was the application of Consolidated Oil's accounting procedures regarding the valuation of oil leases." She held up a stack of papers bearing the COG logo. "Are these the procedures in question, Miss Oakes?" I recognized them immediately. They were the same documents I'd looked at in the motel room. "Yes, ma'am," I replied. Randy then handed them to the defense attorney for review. After a cursory review by Jorgensen and the defense attorney, the procedures were admitted into evidence. Randy returned to the witness stand. Miss Oakes, I noticed a notation in small print at the bottom of each page. Could you tell us what it is and what its significance is? I took the sheets from her again. It's a revision date. Every time a change is made to a procedure, a revision date is given so there is no confusion. And what is the revision date for these particular procedures? She innocently asked. I read the date aloud to the court. And is that date important to you, Miss Oakes? She asked. Yes, I said emphatically. It is the very day Mr. Jorgensen attacked me. The defense attorney immediately objected to my use of the word assault, but the judge waved him off. I want to hear where this is going, counselor. Randy was unfazed. If the procedure changes, how will the auditors in the field at Consolidated know to apply the new standards? She asked me. I turned to look directly at Kurt Jorgensen. He refused to meet my gaze. Our supervisor should notify us of any changes, I said. Did Mr. Jorgensen notify you of the change in procedure? Asked Randy. I looked at Jorgensen in disgust. No, he didn't. He gave me the assignment because he knew I wouldn't know about the last-minute changes. He set me up for failure and then took advantage of me. While I was giving my last answer, the defense attorney was on his feet and objecting so loudly that the judge had to use his gavel to restore order. When everyone finally quieted down, he gave us a look. I don't want to hear any more noise like that in my courtroom, understand? Then he sat back down in his seat. We've had a long day of testimony, and it's getting late. We'll adjourn for the day and reconvene in the morning. Court is adjourned. Our little group returned to Randy's office in a jovial mood. We made some big points today, Randy announced cheerfully. Bill was still surprised at how things had gone. How did you even know the COG changed its policy? He asked her. Randy smiled. I always thought it was odd that Jorgensen suddenly replaced Annie, especially when she was brand new to the position. I also wondered how Annie could have even made such an obvious mistake. It seemed to me that it had to be a setup. But it was Annie who found the smoking gun when she noticed the date of the revised procedures. Jorgensen was aware of the impending changes, but the online procedures had not been updated until the day Annie was working on her assignment. The printed versions probably weren't distributed for another week. At that moment, Randy's secretary appeared. There's a phone call for you, Miss Rubenstein. I think you'll want to take this. It's the defense attorney. Randy disappeared into another office to take the call, and Bill changed the subject. Oh my gosh, Annie Oakley, I couldn't believe it when you walked into the courtroom. I almost dropped my eyeballs. So you like my new look? I asked hopefully. You like it? I love it. I always thought you looked good, but today you look like a model. What happened yesterday? I started to tell him about my experience with Randy's daughter at Nordstrom's, but before I could finish, Randy barged back into the office. I told you we have them. They want to make a deal. They're offering each of you $1 million to settle the lawsuit. Bill let out a battle cry and started dancing around the room. But when Randy looked at me, I just said, no. Bill twitched and stared at me. No? Why not? I folded my arms and dropped my jaw. $2 million each for Bill and me, $2 million for Betty Murphy, who had to go through the same thing I did, and $5 million to the Houston Women's Center. I looked at Randy. Plus, they'll cover the attorney's fees. And one more thing. Kurt Jorgensen will be fired. All that, or we go back to court. Randy looked at me appraisingly, then grinned. Well, it looks like our yellow rose has grown a few thorns. I'll be right back. Bill looked at me perplexed. Are you sure, Annie Oakley? We won the battle today, but that doesn't guarantee we'll win the war. It's quite possible we'll walk away with nothing. I looked at him triumphantly. I didn't come back here to settle for half a loaf, Buffalo Bill. If they want to fight, I'm here to fight. Just then Randy walked in, and she wasn't smiling. I didn't get the numbers you wanted. Then a smirk appeared on her face. I got $5 million for you three and $10 million for the Women's Center. We burst into cheers of joy and started hugging each other. Oh yes, Randy interrupted us. Kurt Jorgensen was involuntarily terminated this afternoon, and Consolidated turned over his information to the district attorney's office. Their attorney also told me that Jorgensen's wife has finally had enough of his machinations and is filing for divorce. After that, we had a real celebration. Randy ordered dinner to be brought in and even opened a bottle of champagne she had saved for a special occasion. When the first glasses were poured, I raised mine in a toast. To Randy Rubenstein, who crossed swords with a giant and won. We all drank our glasses, and then Bill refilled them and offered his own toast. And to the new Annie Oakley, strong, brave, and beautiful. I blushed thickly, but the other two wouldn't let me bow out, and we drank again. When we were done with our food and drinks, Randy escorted us both out. You two need to get out of here. You may not be on the hook, but I still have to go to court tomorrow and settle the details of finalizing the settlement agreement. We both walked over and gave the diminutive lawyer a hug, then headed out into the night. I'd love to give you a ride to the motel, Bill offered chivalrously as we got into his car. No, I said quickly, and he turned to me in surprise. I looked at him hopefully. I told you I didn't come here to settle for half a loaf, Buffalo Bill. I want you to take me to your place tonight. He turned in his seat to look me straight in the eye, then asked me, Are you sure, Annie? Without another word, he sped off into the night. I felt very strong in the courtroom, and even stronger when I asked Buffalo Bill to take me home with him. Standing in the living room of his apartment, however, I felt my insecurity returning, and I couldn't look him in the eye. But if I was nervous, Bill didn't show the slightest hesitation. He just picked me up on my feet and carried me to his bedroom. The next morning he asked me, So, now that you're rich, do you know what you're going to do with all that money? Actually, I do, at least in part. I'm going to give half of it to my foster parents in Tyler. They've been very good to me, and this is my chance to repay them for all they've done. Then I looked at him. What about you? What are you going to do with yours, Bill? Oh, I know exactly what I'm going to do, he said confidently. I'm going to use it to go back to Colorado and start my own accounting firm. Look, Annie, he began. Do you want to? Will you come with me, Annie, if you want to? Oh, yes, Bill, I said fervently. I want that more than anything in the world. The end. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, so subscribe to my channel and watch the next video.